Hi, this is Dan Reimold from College Media Matters and the textbook Journalism of Ideas. This is the Journalism in Pop Culture podcast, aiming to break down some of the more significant and silly depictions of journalists and journalism in popular films, shows, and books of mostly recent vintage. Talking today about Shattered Glass, undoubtedly considered by most in the business as the best, or at least one of the best, journalism movies of the 21st century so far. Of course, as anyone who's worked for even a millisecond in the field or who is currently teaching journalism knows, the 2003 film, based on a true story, stars Hayden Christensen, the actor who, of course, went on to play a young Darth Vader in the Star Wars prequels. I always liked that tie-in. I feel like it's also fitting, given his role in Shattered Glass as the fallen, you could even argue evil, title character, of course named Stephen Glass. In the late 1990s, Glass, in the film, as he was in real life, was a reporter and associate editor at a respected news magazine in Washington, D.C. called The New Republic. They like to bill themselves as the official in-flight magazine of Air Force One. Through his work at TNR and via a ton of freelancing that he was doing on the side for a number of A-list outlets, Glass had already carved out a name for himself at that point in his career near the top of the journalism totem pole, while still only in his early to mid-20s. Kind of insane when you really think about that. It was done in part through his reputation for grabbing incredibly unique, insider-y, and often sensational stories, events, sources, and quotes. Many of them, alas, were later proven to be greatly exaggerated or simply wholly fabricated. And it is the New Republic staff's journey toward discovering, and I think even more importantly, accepting that fact, and the work of an online news startup in rightfully exposing those journalistic faux pas that form the heart of the Shattered Glass film, one of my opinion, one of the more aptly named films of recent vintage. I would predict with confidence that this is one of the most common films shown in journalism classes nationwide and during orientation week in student newsrooms everywhere, in part because it cuts such a wide educational swath. It's embedded with obvious elements of journalism ethics. It's got the reporting and editing 101 stuff in there. There's an insider's look of sorts at magazine journalism. And there's even a brief historical snippet thrown in a number of scenes, displaying digital journalism's early days. In this case, again, roughly the late 1990s, so long ago. I love the film because its essence screams accuracy when it comes to the rhythms and routines of journalism. Let's be honest, so many journalism movies involve larger-than-life superheroes, literally. Only life or death plot setups or twists, screaming matches in the newsroom, or those race against the clock where the apocalypse happens, type of story deadlines. Shattered Glass is quieter. I feel like it's more in touch with how the journalism world operates, at least as much as can be shown on screen. The look and feel of a newsroom, the running of an editorial meeting, even the informal staff interactions that happen in and out of work. I thought they do a nice job of that in various scenes in the movie. And also how reporting is carried out, or, of course, in this case, how it can be fabricated. It's so easy to see the film as a direct intro into a basic lesson on Bad Journalist 101. Placing Stephen Glass alongside Janet Cook of the Washington Post, Jason Blair of the New York Times, and others who have landed in the unofficial Journalism Hall of Shame. And there's definitely a place for that lesson, for that perspective. In my opinion, though, there's absolutely a ton more in play here. Stuff that's really worth exploring. In respect to the real life or mostly real life scenarios, characters, and big questions being depicted and asked on screen. So in that spirit, this is a quick breakdown of some of the most significant and I'd say interesting journalism issues on full display or buried just beneath the surface of Shattered Glass. Hopefully at least a few that are worth a discussion or debate. Okay, so the first big journalism ethics issue arising in the film, and literally the first one chronologically shown on screen in one of the first scenes of the movie, is the idea of establishing a phony identity, or going undercover to get the story. You see Glass in a hotel room at night after another day has transpired of a conservatives convention. He's there partying and talking with a number of young Republicans who apparently are not as taken with the conservatives movement as the convention would have the public believe. We do later learn that this entire story was either fully made up or greatly exaggerated. But in the moment in this film, as it plays out, it provides an interesting flashpoint for a larger debate on just how important and how ethically okay it is or is not to pose as someone else to get a story. He does not reveal he is a reporter, at least as it's shown on screen. He's simply there chatting with the gang, observing what they are doing, and ultimately reporting on some pretty bad misdeeds. Everything from them apparently doing coke to getting crazy drunk to, in the most, frankly, disturbing scene in the film, in my opinion, from just a sheer vulgarity perspective, literally hiring a prostitute, a woman who happens to have a few extra pounds on her, simply so they can tease her mercilessly about her weight, to the point that she is shown on screen running down the hallway to get away from these men, either just cannot take the taunting anymore or because she might legitimately be scared. Is it worthwhile and ethically okay for him to have gone undercover to get these sorts of details and to get this story as part of the reporting on the larger conservatives convention at that time? So I think we can all agree that undercover reporting is an activity that should only be engaged in if there is truly no other way to get at something even close to the truth. And on top of that, only if the story, what you are after, is considered of such urgency to the public or of such great public interest that not only is there no other way to get that information, but that it simply needs to be told for that greater good. I don't see this story at all meeting that criteria. And if anything, seems both obvious to me and something that is going to end up hurting both Glass and the New Republic, the magazine he works for as depicted in the film, down the road more than helps in respect to that immediate, maybe sensational splash of getting tongues wagging for dropping an interesting story. I'm just not sure that he's giving anything that's going to be of such fascination and surprise that it's worth this level of unscrupulous activity to get at the details. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe 20-somethings at a convention with time to kill and in a private hotel suite when around each other with the testosterone flowing might be engaging in some below-board activities and even potentially some illegal ones. Believe me, there's some interesting details in that story as it's presented by Glass, but I'm not sure that it's anything that is really worthy of such a monumentally unethical way of getting the story to expose it. I also think it creates problems for the New Republic and for Glass. This not only has the potential to anger the conservatives and the convention goers who are specifically either cited in the piece or aligned with that group or with that convention, but also might anger all Republicans or Republican supporters who feel like they are being thrown under the bus. Bottom line, you want to be careful when engaging in anything even akin to stunt or undercover reporting, and especially when it can be such a consequential and controversial story such as this. You really might want to think twice about this. A second interesting aspect raised by the film is the idea of what, again, the character Stephen Glass states outright in the movie. And that is, simply put, there is a hole in even the toughest editing process that is employed by even leading professional news outlets. And that's the idea that if the journalist at the heart of the fact-checking process is purposefully attempting to get around it, it can be very tough to discern the truth. You know, the idea that the journalist knows the system and thus knows how to game the system. When you literally have one of your own attempting to trick and deceive your own staffers. It can be akin to what I sometimes have seen as a metaphor of the suicide bomber in Times Square. You know, the notion that we as you know, the US as a big military might be able to ferret out the big-time war plans of an entire country, or the huge networks that are attempting to collaborate and bring destruction and ruin upon us. But how are we going to stop one of the millions, hundreds of millions of lone individuals who, with a homemade bomb strapped to their chest, step into the middle of Times Square? That can be a very difficult thing to stop or to know of in advance. And it's like this, that if you have a lone journalist acting with extreme intent, hell-bent on getting around a system that he or she knows inside out, and especially as someone that the outlet and the fellow editors have come to trust, that can be a very tough thing to stop. And as you can see, it's obviously something that took the New Republic by surprise. So how do you stop that? How do you even set up a system that would in any way lessen the potential for that happening? I turn to one of my favorite programs, The West Wing. One of the characters in one of the early episodes on season 1 mentions that something like the smallpox virus can be unleashed in a major metropolitan area, and there wouldn't be a lot that the government could do to stop it. But one of the main ways that they could play a part in helping out is to contain it once it has been unleashed. And that one main strategic way of containing it is to surround enough of the infected people with as many healthy people as possible, so to kind of stamp out the potential spread of the disease. And I do think that that potentially is the main way to go about handling the, lone gunmen or suicide bombers in your own newsroom who are intent on lying for a variety of reasons, is to build up a culture in the newsroom as much as possible of honesty, to instill through, workshops and off-the-books collaboration and just plain education the importance and the ins and outs of how to go about practicing good journalism. It may not be able to ultimately stop then the ones who want to inflict harm on the outlet or go ahead and be unethical and deceive, but at least it will protect the outlet overall by encasing them in a shell of good journalists who's either going to be able to spot it earlier on or be able to hold up the outlet's reputation in the fallout in the wake of an unfortunate unethical breach. One related component here of the idea of having that hole in even the toughest of editing processes is the role that the editors play, especially as depicted in the film, as allowing this to happen. This is one of the most overlooked plot angles, in my opinion, in respect to what gets discussed and not discussed in various workshops and conferences and even classrooms that I've been in when shattered glass becomes a focal point. We all know that Stephen Glass is just plain wrong and either doggedly evil or a poor kid in over his head making wrong decisions. The editors, though, if not just as culpable, are still incredibly guilty of bad editing, bad management, tons of oversights that allows this to happen, from not enacting any sort of common sense in their editing process. For example, when Stephen Glass discusses details of the story that ultimately brought about his undoing, Hack Heaven, about the young hacker who was attending a hackers conference and who had a hacking agent and who was working with what ultimately proved to be fake company after hacking them to then get signed by them to, supposedly protect them from other hackers. Apparently not a single editor, while going through and vetting that story, thought to either go to a search engine, a basic directory, or even just ask any questions about whether an actual National Association of Hackers existed, whether the company that was discussed was real, whether that hacking agent had a license anywhere to be, an above-board agent. Tons of those sorts of questions apparently, were not addressed by the editors, and as it's sort of subtly referred to in the film, apparently missed some of these other big questions in his past pieces as well. So, just the notion of being both a good common sense editor, but also truly playing your part as either copy editor or vetter, especially of a between the lines features type story. It's one of the basic rubrics of journalism. Even if your mother says she loves you, you get a second source. We're not supposed to be cynical, but we're supposed to be skeptical. And in that role, the editors really didn't do their job. Okay, another element shown on screen that is very accurate as to the real-life goings-on and the long tradition of the New Republic is the importance of photographs, of images, improving reality, in showing that certain things are actually happening, certain sources are real, certain events are taking place. TNR was very famous for not publishing photos. It's ultimately something that even the lowest level employee at the place, the secretary who works at the front desk, mentions to Chuck Lane, the editor at the very end, what could have prevented all this? Pictures. How can you make up things and people that had to be photographed? And there's a lot of credence to that. Definitely some interesting embedded issues involved that I think are worthy of discussion. Obviously, some of the biggest ethical breaches in the digital age especially have been due to cropping, photoshopping, and other doctoring that has made what we see in an image far from what was actually pictured. But it still definitely cuts to the heart of my larger thesis, which that as much as the film is about a single journalist's downfall, there's a lot to be said for how much the outlet overall failed both itself and its readers. And in this case, not requiring photos even for background research or simply verification, I think is a big faux pas and an oversight, and one that ultimately TNR has worked to correct, and I think serves as a guiding lesson for other journalism outlets going forward. There's also really a human element to this story embedded within the journalism arena that I think is worth bringing up here. And that's simply the hardcore pressure that you see Stephen Glass apparently under to be succeeding as such a high-level journalist at such a young age. You see what is basically a kid on screen, trying to write and report, also going to law school apparently at night to please his parents, while also freelancing on the side. And as he moves into this role of associate editor, which he's taken over and shown on screen, acting out in certain cases, trying to help various members of the staff with their own stories. And all the while trying to also live a life as a 23-year-old. We see him throwing a party at one point for some of his friends and colleagues. So I think there's a lot to be said for seeing his story not only as an unethical journalist run amok, but also from the human perspective on simply what can occur when you dump too many responsibilities and too much of a spotlight on a still up-and-coming journalist. We live in this digital era where you can become gigantically huge, either in journalism circles or simply within the wider web or on social media at an incredibly young age, and while you are still forming your identity and maturing as a journalist. Would he have been a different journalist? Could this story have turned out differently if he had peaked a little bit later? If he had been able to go slower and focus more on single reports at a time instead of all the other things that were clouding up both his free time and his judgment, I guess we'll never know. Maybe his personality and his drive to succeed would have trumped all that. But man, awfully young to be, in such a position. And I think it might have been really helpful for someone to take a step back and give him a little more freedom to find out who he was as a journalist. Okay, two other big issues in play that I think are worthy of a solid discussion. One, as we see at the end of the film, is the start of TNR's rehabilitation campaign and their long-term investigation into the veracity of the work of their now former staffer. It's one of the more interesting quandaries that I see being faced by a lot more student outlets, along with professional outlets nowadays, which is simply, how do you handle it when one of your own screws up? How do you deal with the public, gain back their trust, ensure that you are completing the same level of oversight and investigatory work that you would do on an outside entity that you feel who has done wrong? How do you right your reputation in the eyes of not only the public, but the sources and competing media? Do you throw the individual under the bus? Do you immediately or more long-term work to institute a new editing process? Do you clean house at the higher levels and get rid of some of the editors, either because they had a hand in things or because you need to do something to show your readership that you are taking this seriously? How big of a deal do you then make it? Do you devote an entire special issue, special section, special permanent part of the website? Do you do it in a single story? Do you put that on the front page? Do you make it personal by including an editor's note somewhere? Do you explain every last details and the machinations of the newsroom and handle it like a news story? Or do you trust that people will get the gist and simply lay it out there and attempt to move on, knowing that the more you might make of it, the more the bad press and attention will come? And how do you judge how to go about each of those scenarios depending on the severity of the crime? In this case, of course, Stephen Glass's wrongdoing cuts to the very heart of what TNR is all about. And seemingly, at least as shown on screen, the editorial staff eventually comes around to the right notion that we need to get on this, get on it quick, and play it as seriously and significantly as possible if we ever want any hope of being seen as a reputable news source by our readers and the Washington elite that we are covering. They do a long-form investigation of all of his past work. They write an apology to readers. From everything I gather, they've added photos and changed their editing process. So a lot happened in that Stephen Glass fallout. And then the last thing to think about is just the idea of how to think of an individual's moral fitness after they have engaged in this sort of wrongdoing. Stephen Glass is currently attempting to become a licensed lawyer. He's apparently passed the bar, but is not being allowed to practice law in the various states through which he's applied because there's questions about his moral character. And you would think rightfully so. How long and how significantly should these types of transgressions follow an individual, even after, in this case, he leaves journalism? Is Stephen Glass always a liar forever and ever for stuff that he did when he was in his early 20s and has tried to potentially make penance for and move on in his life? And more interesting to me is how should that apply at the student level? If someone does wrong on the student newspaper or other student media outlet, should that impact potentially their graduation status? Should it impact how a professor looks at him or her in a related journalism class that the individual is taking? Should it possibly hurt them in respect to a scholarship that they've received from the school, or maybe another activity or organization in which they are involved in, or even an outside internship that they are taking or have recently been accepted into? And how long should it follow them? Should you, as maybe editor of a news outlet, ensure that the Google prints are out there that will forever scar this individual as they attempt to move forward? Do you think it's more important that potential employers know what this person has done in the past versus giving that individual a chance at a second opportunity and to make right? How much comes into play that, yes, even though students are of legal age in the college setting, they're still, of course, finding their identity and maturing as journalists, and there may be hiccups and full-blown mistakes, even purposeful ones, made along the way. Should there be different credence given to a student journalist's unethical act versus a professional journalist in respect to how long or how significantly it should follow them? And then the most interesting twist in the tale. What if a member of your news outlet at the student level screws up significantly or is unethical in another setting? Say they get in trouble for plagiarizing something in a journalism class. Say they screw up in their journalism internship or their side freelancing work. Is that the sort of thing that should have repercussions for their standing at your student news outlet, even though the cheating, lying, plagiarizing, fabricating did not happen while officially a staffer at the outlet? These are all interesting questions and all come to the heart of how we now think of Stephen Glass today, more than a decade after his wrongdoing. Is he forever simply branded a bad boy journalist in the Journalist Hall of Shame? Or is he someone who screwed up as a young guy and should be given the right to have a second chance and potentially move forward and even, as we often preach in journalism educator circles, be someone who can learn from his mistakes and even educate others so that they do not make the same mistakes? It's a tough call and ultimately part of the array of interesting issues presented by the film.